So in this video, we're going to discuss how do we figure out what the attributes of a quadratic function are based on the graph. So in this word bank, we have a couple of the really important words that we're going to use here to identify this quadratic function. So in class, we learned that a quadratic function has a squared on it, and because of the squared, it's going to make it look like this U shape. We call this U shape a parabola. One of the first things that we can kind of relate back to a line is this point right here. It's called the y-intercept because this is when this graph hits the y-axis. So if you remember, a y-intercept is a point. So the x value here is 0. My y value is -3. So this point would be 0, -3 in this case. Now, just like that, we can talk about these 2 points right here. This is when the curve hits the y-axis. So unlike a line, a quadratic can have, and a lot of times it has, 2 x-intercepts. It could also have 1 if we shifted this all the way up and it only hit once. And it could also have none if we shifted all the way up here and then it never went down and touched below that. So let's go ahead and label this. So this is an x-intercept. And there are various words for x-intercepts. We can also call these, if you remember when we were doing lines, the zeros. So in this case, it's plural, right? Because there's multiple. There's 2. Then we can also call this the solutions when f of x equals 0. Again, it's the value of x when y is 0. And the last thing that we can call this is roots. So this mainly, roots basically has to do with a quadratic function. And it's going to basically, remember, this is the value of x. So if it has a squared on it, one of the ways that we can solve for is by taking the square root, hence the name. So these are all the 4 names that I can use for these 2 points. So yes, it does have a lot. So let's talk about what these 2 points are. So this point right here, the x is 1. Again, the y is 0, well, -1. And then this point right here, the x is 3, and the y is 0. Now, another very important point on this graph is right here, this vertex, this point right here called the vertex. The reason this is important is because this is the changing point of the graph. Before, first it started going down and then it hit this point and then it started going back up. Again, the vertex is a point, just like the y-intercept and the x-intercept. So the coordinates of this point are 1, -4. And then depending on the graph, we can either call the vertex a minimum or a maximum. In this case, this graph is going, this point right here is the smallest point that we have, so we would call it a minimum. If it were what I'd like to call the top of the mountain, it would be a maximum, but in this case, it's just minimum. We're not going to use this word maximum here because it's either one or the other. And then the last thing that we need to discuss is this line right here. This is called the line of symmetry. So basically what the line of symmetry does is it cuts it right in half. It's always going to go through the vertex. And so if you notice, it's like a mirror. These 2 parts look exactly the same. So a quadratic is really nice because it's symmetrical. So this part's going to look just like this part. And that's going to help us a lot when we start graphing. Okay, so this line, again, it's a line. So we need to use what we know about lines to make an equation for it. So let's go ahead and label it axis of symmetry. And then it's a line, so it's a straight line where the slope is undefined. So it basically, we would call this x equals, it's always going to be an x equals line. And x equals 1. All right, so for the next example, I would like you, if you could pause the video and kind of try to do it on your own. We're going to do the same thing, but this time this parabola is going down. and we're going to label everything and find what they are. So again, we're going to start with the y-intercept, which is right here. And this point is going to be 0, 3. Then we're going to label the x-intercepts. And remember, we have multiple words for x-intercept. We can call them zeros. We can call them solutions, specifically solutions when f of x equals 0. And we can call these also roots in this case for a quadratic, because that's how we will be solving for them. And in this case, we have, again, two x-intercepts. So one of them is -3, 0, and the other one is +1, 0. The next point that we have that's important is the turning point here, which we call the vertex. In this case, it's the top, it's the highest point, so we would call it a maximum. And then this line right here, we call it the axis of symmetry. So let's go ahead and label what the vertex and the axis of symmetry are. So my axis of symmetry, my vertex here is the point -1, 4. And so again, the axis of symmetry always goes through the vertex. And so when I'm writing the equation for it, it's the line x equals -1. So you should see that this number right here is common with the x value of the vertex. So this is the end of this video, and I hope that you found this helpful.